In this video, we're going to have a look at how to create components. So in the previous videos, we've seen how to create the layout, the master page, how to create listing pages. But what we're going to focus on going forward is how to actually create components. Now, what I've done is I started thinking about components in terms of what types of components are there in any site. So when you think about a site, what do you have? You have highlights or call to actions. You have content components that just display content like announcements, stuff like that. Listing components that might be listing items like a linked list, or might be something that's querying data like a featured news. Categorized listing that's actually categorized based on a specific category. For example, you want to categorize your news based on a specific tag, or you want to categorize your articles based on their type, and so on and so forth. Then you have the carousel, which is in Sitecore. It's one of the SXA components. However, the current or the SXA out of the box component usually doesn't fit most needs, given that it's using an older version of the Carousel JavaScript plugin or a library. Aggregators, which ultimately just aggregate data from different components within the site, and external aggregators that are aggregators that actually aggregate from external systems. Forms, of course, and tabs. These are the main components that I came up with when looking at what components I might see in any site. Now, if we look at each of these, I'm going to go through them on a high level now, and then we're going to actually create a video talking about each one of them and how we create it using Sitecore, and which Sitecore component would we ultimately need to clone to accomplish it. So when you talk about highlights and call to actions, the first thing that comes in mind is the promo, of course, because highlights and call to actions are actually, in fact, just like the promo. You might have a highlight, for example, that has maybe a background image, a title, a subtitle, and even something like a search box, like you see here in this wireframe. And in such a scenario, what we utilize is the SXA 1.8 capability of adding components within a rendering variant. So just very high level, what I've done here is I've cloned the promo, and then I created a rendering variant that has a background image, that has a subtitle and a title, and of course has a rendering of a component within the rendering variant itself, which is the search box. Content components, as we said, so it can be something like a chairman's message, an announcement, and so on. And this is just a pure clone from the promo, and maybe changing the fields in the data template if need be. Now, listing components are one of the most interesting components I've actually had to work with, because by default, Sitecore provides you with a linked list and the page list as two different types of listing components. However, if you look at each one of them, they do have some pros and cons. For instance, the linked list is really good. It's able to show you a list of items, but it does not aggregate content from other components or from a query within Sitecore. So that's why I've separated actually between the listing component and aggregators, but listing component is ultimately a linked list clone with rendering variant. But if we look at aggregators, this is where it becomes a bit more tricky, because the first thing that came to mind when creating aggregator was use the page list. However, unfortunately, the out-of-the-box page list is not personalizable. So you cannot do personalization on the page list that Sitecore has created. So what I had to do with that one, with the aggregator, is to actually create my own type, my own, I developed my own backend controller for it. That's actually very similar to the page list. It just overrid some of the missing functionalities, I would say, in the page list component. I have also shared it with Sitecore, and they have added it as a new feature request. Categorized listing is also a really interesting one, because once you've created the aggregator or that page list with aggregation capability, all you need to do ultimately is just play around on how it's being rendered based on a categorization. Carousel, as I said, Carousel is already there in Sitecore. The only thing is that I've really had to change it or create a new one just for being able to use more advanced capabilities in newer plugins. If you've tried the out-of-the-box Carousel, you'll see that it has some issues with responsive design. It has some issues with mobile versions and so on. So that's why we had to go through that route. We've talked about the aggregator. As I said, this is probably the most interesting component I've had to create when creating any component within Sitecore. Now, external aggregators, as I said, can be things that are retrieving data from external systems. So I have two scenarios for that. The first one is something like I want to show social media feed. So I want to show the latest social media, like the latest Facebook posts, the latest tweets, and so on and so forth. That's about my company, for example. And that I might want to do real time. So in this scenario, what we're going to see is we created a controller that actually retrieves this data in real time and shows it. The second way is if I want something that's not real time. So in this scenario, we use data exchange to actually take that data, put it into Sitecore, and then read it through an external, through a normal aggregator. So it wouldn't really be an external aggregator, right? And we're going to see how I've combined the listing and the aggregator and the external aggregator into one component that actually supports these different capabilities as well. Of course, forms, I always prefer to use the Sitecore forms. However, there are some limitations, and you're going to quickly realize that once you start creating more advanced forms and wizards and so on, you might find that it's not fulfilling your needs. You do have to do a lot of customization to create your own types and so on. But also, one of the things that I've personally had such a great time working with when creating custom forms and custom e-services is actually using JSS and combining it and creating pages of JSS. And we're going to discuss that once we get to that type of component. And tabs, I honestly usually use the out-of-the-box tabs for that. So this is a brief on my thoughts around the different components. In our next videos, we're going to see how we actually go about creating each and every one of these. So I'm going to go through like a walkthrough of how to create each one of them. Thanks so much for watching.